little while ago, I made a video called Leon's Story. This was the tale of a heroic Polish flyer from the Second World War who sadly died when his Halifax bomber, carrying supplies to the Warsaw Uprising, was shot down over Hungary in 1944. As my investigations went on, the story spread beyond the fateful night and involved his extended family and many other people right up until the present day. We found a small sleepy village in England that wasn't quite what it seemed to be. We uncovered the role of the SS and a convicted war criminal. We identified the Luftwaffe pilot who made the kill, and we were granted insights into the lives of the ordinary people caught up in this affair. The video ended with the final resting place of Leon Witkowski and his fellow crew members in a British war cemetery in Hungary. But the research had uncovered so much more that I was determined to make a sequel, which I call Norman's Story. Let's start in that sleepy little village of Burton upon Stather. That description, at least for a critical part of the Second World War, is very far from the truth. Due to its location beside the River Trent in the east of England and the topographical similarity to key river crossing sites in France and Germany, it became a top-secret area, training troops for D-Day and the invasion of Europe. It was also used for developing the floating tank technology that significantly contributed to the success of the landings. But before we get to the inventions, it's time to meet Norman. Sergeant Norman Cooper was part of 318 Field Security Section, a team responsible for maintaining the secrecy at the site. He was born on 13th of December 1915 in Norbury, Surrey, in this house. A little while after, the family moved to this property in Maidenhead, where they became very involved in the local community and from where his father Horace travelled to the City of London to conduct his spice business. Here we can see Norman on the left, together with his younger brother Roy next to him. Norman attended Reading Grammar School, and he was apparently very good at languages, speaking both French and German. In 1933, he travelled to France, Switzerland and Germany. Since this was the year when the Third Reich was established and Dachau concentration camp was opened, this must have been quite an experience. In 1936, following the death of his father, the family moved back to Cookham, where the Coopers had been involved in businesses since the mid-1800s. Norman joined the army in March 1940, and because of his language skills and some military experience gained in the School Cadet Corps, was transferred to the security branch. Although earmarked for officer training, he remained an NCO, eventually being transferred to Burton upon Stather. There is also a strong possibility that he spent some time at GCHQ Bletchley Park, where the Enigma code was broken, and he was also called upon to interrogate German aircrew that were captured in the area. In the village, not even the locals were allowed near the riverside when the tests were going on. They had to stay inside their houses with the curtains drawn when the secret equipment and tanks passed by. And it was part of Norman's role to ensure that the instructions were followed. This involved riding his motorcycle up and down the road, checking on the various houses. Since Dulcie, who had married Leon Witkowski, the subject of our earlier video, was living with her parents quite close to the river, Norman must have been a familiar figure to her. And she remembered him calling out, in, and no looking through the window. Apparently, though, Dulcie had a good view of all the testing from her bedroom. Dulcie's father, Roland, known as Roly, as with previous generations of the family, was the local ferryman, and also an expert on the river, the sandbanks and the currents. Here's a picture of him with Dulcie's husband, Leon, taken before the marriage. In fact, Rowley was often called upon to advise the military regarding the river during the testing, and he had to sign the Official Secrets Act. In June of 1944, exactly when the D-Day landings that had been so extensively prepared for at Burton upon Stather were actually happening, Norman and Rowley shared an experience that both of them would probably have preferred to avoid. A Miles Martinet two-seater training aircraft from RAF Ossington, close to nearby Newark, and flown by 22-year-old pilot officer Gordon Smith, was a frequent visitor to the area due to the ease of navigation along the River Trent. Sometimes it would be towing a drogue, which was a target used to train fighter pilots. Here we see a fighter pilot checking his hits on such a target. The drogue was controlled by a second crew member operating the device on the side of the aircraft. But on this day, Gordon was flying solo, since there was no drogue and his task was to provide specific training for a Hawker Hurricane. Strong evidence suggests that he appears fourth from the left in the front row of this photograph taken of the Ossington squadron. He was an experienced pilot with 362 hours of flying experience, 134 of them on the Martinet. At 15:20 on the afternoon of 7th of June, at the same time as Allied troops were landing at Omaha Beach in Normandy, P.O. Smith was flying low, approaching the pylons that carried cables over the river. Instead of pulling up, as he would have done many times before, he decided to fly under the cables. Whether the hot June weather had caused them to sag more than normal and they clipped the plane's wings, or whether he didn't notice the fast approaching sandbank, we'll never know. But either way, he lost control of the aircraft and flew into the hillside next to the river. The Hurricane, which was following him, climbed steeply, radioed Ossington about the accident and returned to base. A search party was immediately put together, and since the best access was via the river, the ferryman, Rowley Reedhead, and Sergeant Norman Cooper set off together to secure the site. The Miles Martinet was a fragile aircraft made of canvas, wood, and aluminium, so there was wreckage strewn over a wide area. The engine was recoverable, but sadly, Gordon Smith died in the crash. He was found by a fence and had suffered catastrophic injuries. The body was wrapped in a tarpaulin and transferred to a garage near the Ferry House Inn, where Dulcie and Leon had had their wedding reception, just across from the Reedhead house. Over the next week, Rowley and his son Bill were engaged in clearing the site, the heavy engine being a particular challenge for their small boat. These are just a few of the parts that were collected. Bill was a young lad at the time, working locally as a gardener, and even he needed an official pass to go near the secret areas. He later went on to serve with the military in Cyprus. The result of the official inquiry into the crash was that Pilot Officer Smith had engaged in unauthorized low flying and was described as being undisciplined. Later investigation of the parts recovered from the site, however, revealed a faulty fuel pipe connection, so it was just possible that the engine had cut off from lack of fuel as he started to climb. We'll never know. Gordon Smith was buried in the family grave in his hometown of Selby, Yorkshire. Rowley and Norman were to meet up again under very different circumstances. So what was all the secrecy about, and why was Norman's role so important? What were the inventions that were being tested, and who were some of the shadowy visitors to Burton upon Stather? As mentioned in Leon's story, Barnes Wallis, the inventor of the bouncing bomb used by the famous dam busters, was very likely one of those visitors. His mission was shrouded in deepest secrecy, but it is believed that he was involved in testing pendulum, a rocket-powered method of sending cables across a river that could then be used for hauling tanks. It is rumoured that one of the tests went wrong, and the resulting explosion blew out windows in many of the surrounding houses. The real reason, of course, was hidden, and the explosion was blamed on an ammunition dump. Another regular visitor to Burton upon Stather was Major General Percy Hobart, the driving force behind the tank developments christened Hobart's Funnies. Known as Hobo, Hobart served in World War I and was the brother-in-law of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the hero of El Alamein and the leader of the British forces on D-Day. And they didn't just have a family connection. Hobart effectively formed the Desert Rats, and later his Funnies, providing great support for the D-Day landing and subsequent push through Europe to the Rhine. He was, however, forced into retirement in 1940 by his superiors, who thought his tank development ideas were crazy. He became a corporal in the Home Guard until he was recalled by Churchill and ultimately formed the 79th Armoured Division. Here we see Hobart and Montgomery, and later on Churchill himself visited the 79th. Among the inventions that Hobart championed was the duplex DD tank, which we'll cover in more detail later. He also developed the AVRE with a spigot mortar for blasting through concrete fortifications, the Sherman Crab tank for dealing with landmines, and various forms of tracks to enable tanks to cross sandy or unstable ground. There were also tank conversions to personnel carriers, flamethrowers, and even an attempt at a mobile bridge. It was, however, the duplex tank that involved much of the research at Burton upon Stather. This was largely the work of a Hungarian engineer, Miklos Straussler. It was the only one of the Funnies used by both the British and American troops on D-Day, possibly further evidence of the mutual distrust between Montgomery and General Patton, the American commander, likely stemming from their disagreements when working together in Malta during the invasion of Italy. Their relationship was far from as friendly as this picture suggests. The duplex tank was fitted with twin propellers and a flotation device. Although an important component in the invasion force, the actual operational situation in a rough sea was very different from the relatively calm River Trent where they were tested, and several of the tanks were swamped and some crews drowned. Usually it was the driver that was at most risk, since the others were mostly on top of the tank as it disembarked from the landing craft. Most commentators agree, though, that the duplex tank was a vital factor in the success of the D-Day landings. Miklos Straussler was an interesting character, and for his story we need to go back to Hungary, not to the northwest of Budapest where Leon is buried, but rather to the southeast. He was born in Isaseg on the 7th of May 1891, close to today's famous Hungaroring Formula One circuit. It appears that his family moved shortly afterwards to a town close by. Isaseg was a cosmopolitan village and had a Jewish quarter with its own synagogue and cemetery, as well as a community of German Slavs. No records now exist of the Straussler family in Isaseg, but some people with that name were taken from the nearby town of Gödelö and were sent to Auschwitz. According to the available documentation, they survived. The Jewish population was removed from the area in 1944 by the Nazis, or more specifically by members of the Hungarian fascist Arrow Cross militia, and most ended up in Auschwitz. Here's a memorial to those families that were specifically taken from Isaseg. Ironically, only 4 years later, the Slavs, who were ethnic German families who'd been living in the area since the 1700s, were forced marched back to Germany by the Allies. Of those that survived, many ended up being housed in concentration camps such as Dachau. Miklos left Hungary for England in 1911. As an engineer, he patented several flotation devices, including collapsible boats, probably similar to these shown in Paris around 1910. In 1932, Straussler designed the first ever purpose-built armoured car. As throughout his career, he worked with major industrial companies, and the AC-1 was built by the Manfred Weiss Works on Chapel Island, Budapest. In 1933, he became a British citizen And he also worked with the British automotive company Alvis, famous for producing hand-built sports cars as well as military vehicles and armaments. His AC-2 and AC-3 tanks were produced by a new company called Miklos Straussler, formed in July 1936. The British Army, however, rejected the design due to an inadequate cooling system, although some were sold to the Dutch Army, amongst others. Unable to sell the AC-2 in bulk to the British Army, he made some upgrades to the design and then licensed it to the Manfred Weiss Company, at that time being run under the control of the Royal Hungarian government and a major contractor to the Hungarian army. It was renamed the 39M Chubba and later used in Operation Barbarossa, Germany's attempted invasion of Russia. It is believed that no originals survived the war, the last ones being destroyed attempting to hold back the Russians in Galicia, in what is today southeastern Poland and western Ukraine. Some were, however, converted to reconnaissance vehicles fitted with a large radio antenna and known as the 40M Chubba. Straussler also designed the Straussler G3, a four-wheel drive truck with two Ford engines that was again built in Hungary and used in limited numbers by the Axis troops. This photograph is remarkable, since there are very few images of Straussler, but he can be seen on the extreme left of this one in front of yet another of his inventions. It's also very likely that he's shown here wearing a similar hat during the tank trials at Burton upon Stather. We can also see the pile-in the background that caused the unfortunate demise of Pilot Officer Smith. Also in the UK, another one of his designs, the Miklos Straussler bomb trolley, was adopted extensively by the RAF, with over 10,000 units being made. Here's a photo of the Polish 300 Squadron where Leon Witkowski served, using that trolley. Miklos Straussler therefore managed to sell his technology to both sides during the war, and in doing so secured his place in Norman's story, since secrecy of the tank developments for D-Day was paramount. His tank flotation devices were still used until the 1980s, although usually for lighter vehicles. After the war, he continued to develop automotive-related devices, including a run-flat tyre and, in the 1960s, a motorised tricycle, the AS-24, of which 460 were made and used by Belgian paratroopers. He kept working into his old age and filed his last patent in 1964, 2 years before his death on the 3rd of June 1966. Another group of temporary residents in Burton upon Stather during the top-secret period was the Canadians. Following the severe losses that the 2nd Canadian Division took during the Dieppe raid in August 1942, it was decided to undertake special training in waterborne invasion in preparation for D-Day. Some local excitement ensued when Exercise Kate began on the 28th of April 1944, since the participants included French Canadians and some villagers claimed a real Native American Indian. Kate stood for crossing a tidal estuary and involved the use of storm boats and rafts or pontoons. It was decided that the River Trent at Burton upon Stather resembled the Seine and also the River Ems near Emden in Germany, both of which would subsequently be crossed by the Canadians. They left the village towards the end of May 1944, ready to form up for the D-Day landing on 6th of June. And here we see them using the techniques they learned crossing the River Seine under fire on 18th of August. Let's return to Burton upon Stather for the final chapter of our story. After Leon's death and following the birth of her daughter Maria, Dulcie struck up a friendship with Sergeant Norman Cooper. The exact circumstances are unknown, but if we look at an aerial view of the village, we can see that the tank ramp, the Ferry House Inn, and the Reedhead House are all very close. The inn was used as an administrative centre for the security team, and, as we've seen, Rowley Reedhead and Norman had met over the Martinet air crash in June of 1944. Maybe they even knew each other before, since Rowley was a frequent advisor to both the tank developers and the Canadians. For this, he would have required security clearance and would have needed to pass through various checkpoints. Norman was discharged from the army in September 1945. His records describe his service as exemplary, although his health appears to have suffered, since in 1940 he was rated A1, but by 1945 was downgraded to C2, making him ineligible for foreign service. Maybe the stress of keeping so many secrets had taken its toll. Certainly a motorcycle crash when he was travelling between Bletchley Park and the family home at Cookham can't have helped. Here's a photo of one of Norman's colleagues on a similar machine. Following the end of the war, Dulcie and Norman became closer, and Maria called him Daddy up to her death from cancer in 1949. Norman had returned to his hometown of Cookham, a historic Thameside village in the county of Berkshire. There were many similarities with Burton upon Stather. There even used to be a ferry across the river, although that had been superseded by a bridge. Apparently, Norman's father, Horace, was famous for diving off the bridge, and this may well have led to his rather premature death from heart failure, aged 47, in 1936. Dulcie joined Norman in Cookham, and they were married at Croydon Registry Office on the 7th of May 1949. Norman had a business in Cookham for almost 20 years following the war. The Coopers were a family of shopkeepers, with enterprises in the area going back over 150 years. This early picture of Cookham shows Cooper's store on the right, and the later photograph shows their two shops. Norman's premises, which traded as a greengrocer and florist, were in what is now the estate agents. This business card is from his grandfather's business, and the letterheading also describes Norman's nursery business at Westmead, the family's 2-acre smallholding. Note the FRHS membership after Norman's name. That means Fellow of the Royal Horticultural Society, and suggests that he had considerable expertise as a nurseryman. Sadly though, by the 1960s it was more and more difficult for such businesses to survive against competition from supermarkets, garden centres and multinationals. After a short attempt at becoming a teacher to share his knowledge of languages, Norman went back to his pre-war office administration role and by 1966 became a chief export clerk and later an office supervisor. Dulcie and Norman went on to have 3 more children, 2 girls and then a boy. This brought her back into the school orbit and she became the dinner lady at St. Joseph's School. Norman retired in 1980, and the couple filled their spare time with their mutual love of gardening. In addition, Norman pursued his lifelong hobby of stamp collecting. He took up photography and loved to tinker with old cars bought at auction. From the early 1980s, his health began to deteriorate though, and he died of bone cancer on 20th of July 1986, aged 70. Wyn Reedhead, Dulcie's brother, described him as follows. Norman was the perfect gentleman, kind and considerate, and one of the nicest men that I have ever met. Dulcie then moved to a smaller property, but still continued her gardening and was the recipient of many awards for her beautiful garden. Her family also continued to bloom, and one of her great joys was receiving visits from them. Dulcie was also entitled to a war widow's pension from her marriage to Leon, and this helped her through her final years. She never did get to see his grave, although her grandchildren showed her pictures. After suffering from breathing problems for many years, Dulcie died of pneumonia on the 3rd of January 2011. It's easy to think of war as being all about leaders and battles. D-Day, Churchill, Montgomery, Hobart, Straussler, they're all part of the story. But fundamentally, it's the ordinary people who bear the greatest burdens. Some, like Leon Witkowski, making the ultimate sacrifice. Others, like Norman Cooper, contributing their watchfulness and diligence. And Dulcie Reedhead, enduring so much sadness and yet pulling through with stoicism and humour. We honour them.